There are no readings for the Delaware Bay because, well, I know more than any of the readings I could find for you. It's that lovely turquoise body of water in that picture. It's a floodplain area, a coastal plain with the Drowned River Valley. It drains 6,000 square miles of land. It has algal blooms every fall and spring. It contains salt marshes, mudflats, beaches, seagrass beds, all sorts of things. And at one point in time, in the 1970s, its waters were declared to never be fishable again. And it's not true at all. Today the waters are fishable. So we're going to have a success story where everyone thought that it would be a complete environmental disaster. And in the span of 50 years, things have turned around so dramatically that people aren't sure how it possibly happened. The link to one article to read for Monday. They all come from the Audubon magazine, so they're relatively easy to read and interesting, and they might talk about birds, but also restoration. So if you could read those for Monday, that would be useful. We're going to finish Delaware Bay today, maybe even start restoration, because it's kind of going to go together. So the Delaware Bay itself is actually a really important, economically important estuary for the East Coast. It is not our largest estuary on the East Coast. Does anyone know what that is? The Chesapeake Bay. So Chesapeake is a little bit south of Delaware, but Delaware is economically incredibly important. Tourism. That one's pretty obvious. Philadelphia, Trenton, Jersey beach towns, Delaware beach towns are all up and down the Delaware Bay. It provides drinking water to more than 15 million people, many of them in the Philadelphia region. The port system does more than $19 billion in import-export work through the Delaware Bay. 70% of the oil entering the United States passes through the Delaware Bay because of the refineries in Philadelphia. It's the second largest refinery area in the country, which puts it at a pretty clear risk for oil spill problems. It's the world's largest freshwater port system. There was a naval yard for quite some time in Philadelphia where there were things coming out and going at all hours of the day. It's the largest receiving center for crude oil, steel, paper, and surprisingly meat imports for the country. That one always surprises me because I feel like paper and meat imports, I don't understand why they come through here. The oyster industry from the Delaware Bay alone makes $1.5 million. And this is actually at a low point in oyster populations. At higher points in oyster populations, you could expect to make more than $2 to $3 million per year in oyster landings. We don't call it oyster fishing. We call it oyster landing. With shellfish, you frequently talk about landing because you're bringing them from the sea onto the land. I'm not sure why. It is connected to the Chesapeake Bay through the C&D Canal, which stands for Chesapeake and Delaware Canal. So a little bit of history. The Delaware region was settled by the Lenni Lenape and the Nanticoke Native American tribes. The Nanticoke tribes still exist in portions of southern Delaware, and they do still have some small governing authority. Mostly not a whole lot of governing authority, but they do have still a chief, and there are a few areas of land that they control. The Spanish and the Portuguese settlers explored the coastline in 1526, which is really early for explorations here. Hudson arrives in 1609. He recorded briefly, that they thought that the Delaware Bay was actually going to be the channel to China. Because remember, everybody thought if they went around far enough, they'd get to China. So the Delaware Bay at one point in time was hoped to be the way to get to China. It was not. But the Dutch claimed and settled a lot of the area in the 17th century. The Swedes were some of the first people to settle the southern portions of the Delaware side of the Delaware Bay, and a lot of things there have Swedish names or Swedish history. It's kind of strange. It's not what you expect. And part of the reason why this was settled early is there's a lot of fresh water and freshwater springs in and around the Delaware Bay area, so ships did not have to come in super far landwise in order to get fresh water and supplies for restocking their needs. The British purchased a lot of the Delaware Bay in the 17th century. And who settled this region for the British? Who was in charge of it? William Penn was in charge of Pennsylvania and Delaware originally. And Delaware was part of Pennsylvania-ish at one point in time as they were settling it before it was colonies. It was used as a port city because of this fresh water. William Penn gets possession in 1682. Philadelphia becomes the largest North American city in the 18th century, and almost anything passing through the colonies that's not going to Boston is passing through here. It was important during the Revolutionary War because Lafayette was stationed at Pea Patch Island, which is part of the Delaware estuary system. And we finally get a channel being formed here that is a maintained channel in 1885. Because with the Delaware estuary, as much as other estuary and bay systems, there's a lot of sediment, particularly once we start doing a lot of farming, that comes down the river, which makes it progressively shallower. So we started maintaining a 26-foot deep channel that was 600 feet wide from Philadelphia on out to the bay. It was then expanded to 30 feet deep. Since the 20th century, there's been a lot of good work done in the Delaware Bay because, as we'll quickly discover, it was considered one of the most polluted areas of water in the United States at one point in time. Since the 1970s, there have been significant drop-offs in contaminant loads. PCB was being dumped regularly into the Delaware Bay. That stopped in the 1970s once it was regulated. And there was a lot of industrial waste going into the Delaware Bay because of a company you've probably heard of before at some point in time. The DuPont Chemical Company is located in Delaware, and they would dump some of their chemical waste into the Delaware River because we believed that that was how you got rid of waste. You just put it in the water. The Delaware Bay area has had a very strange history with management. One of the strangest things is that we used to ditch all of the wetlands. They would dig ditches in them. Anyone know why you might dig ditches in wetlands? To drain them, to create more space for agriculture, and to control one specific pest, the mosquito. Having said that, wetland ditching is not good at controlling mosquito populations, but that was even done as late as the 1960s through salt marshes into the southern portions of Delaware. If you go today, the ditches are still evident, so evident, in fact, that you can see them from aerial photography. And you can see these lines crisscrossing the marshes. It was considered and has been considered one of the most polluted rivers in the world. Even still in the 20th century, at one point in time, it was considered to be one of the most polluted rivers in the world. In part because you have this massive population. And we've had really bad river management. But this is true just about everywhere. We've had bad river management. It is still the second busiest waterway in the United States. It is part of the Intercoastal Waterway, which is like a highway for shipping. In 2013, though, the National Resource Defense Council listed the beach water quality of Delaware as number 1 and New Jersey as number 3. Just shocking, considering that I remember beaches in New Jersey when I was little being closed, as I told you guys, for hypodermic needles and things like that, and medical waste. It is cleaner today than it was 100 years ago. Probably cleaner today than it was almost 150 years ago. The industrial regulation, or the industrial discharge, is tightly regulated and not permitted. DuPont, having dumped toxic materials in the Delaware Bay, but also in the Potomac River and in its tributaries, has actually paid greatly for this. And one of the things that they've done is they have started and paid for research programs to be done on the systems that they have impacted, as a way of kind of giving back and paying for their sins, if you will. Environmentalists tend to have one of two mindsets about how this works. One is the idea that, well, the company is doing something and they're trying to find some redemption for the bad that they've done by paying for this. The other is they think we're going to forgive them for what they've done because they paid for some research. And it's hard to really fall on one side or the other. But I think that commitment that they're putting their money there and that they are involved in supporting graduate students and faculty members that are doing research in the Bay is really important, because they could choose not to. And instead, from what I've seen, they've supported research projects, even those that have proven what some of the bad things were that they did. It's not like they're selective going, well, this one's going to say we're good, so we'll fund them. They're picking it on scientific merits. The upper portions of the Delaware Bay, or the Delaware Estuary, are mainly dominated, not shockingly, by industry and residential areas. Think about Trenton, think about Philadelphia, think about Chester. These areas, as things move through, they're industrial and residential. The lower portions in southern Delaware specifically, even southern New Jersey, are dominated by agriculture with some residential. The entire area is considered urbanized. It's not really rural. Let's have pollution. I don't remember who wrote this, but in 1769 there was a note regarding the Delaware River at Philadelphia, and the river was called a mess. We're dealing with all of the chemicals and all of the trash and everything that were floating down in it. 1940, it's rated as one of the most grossly polluted areas in the United States by federal agencies. 1950s, the dissolved oxygen levels during the summer for much of the bay were 0. What does that tell you about fish populations? Not real good. In 1961, JFK starts the Delaware River and Basin Commission, which is tasked in part with cleaning up the estuary, but also in maintaining the channel and correct disposal of the sediments that they dredge out to widen and deepen the channel. That matters for one very important reason. Mud is really good at absorbing toxins. And when you have all of your toxins and all of your heavy metals and everything buried in this mud, if you're just pulling it up and dumping it someplace else in the estuary, you're actually recontaminating your system all over again. So they had to find confined places where they were going to put that. Most of it ended up in salt marshes, which meant some of the toxins got back into the system. But salt marsh plants are some of the most shockingly resilient plants that I know, and they seem to be able to handle more stress, even from metals and things, than just about anything else. By 1973, the EPA is telling us that the waters will never be fishable again. In 1973, and again in 1990, the phosphate detergent ban was passed, which starts changing everything, because that starts changing the eutrophication issues that are happening. And by 1988, the cleanup is considered a success. 1973, the waters will never be fishable again. 1988, we've done really good. 1990, they spent $1.5 billion of Clean Water Act funds to clean up the Delaware estuary. But remember, this is something that generates more than $19 billion of money a year just in things coming into and out of the port. 1994, this region has a complete halting of phosphate detergent production. It used to be produced in some areas in Maryland, which would lead to contamination of the Chesapeake and the Delaware Bay. By 2005, the dissolved oxygen levels had returned to levels that maintain fish populations year-round. The migratory shad and the striped bass, which are very sensitive to dissolved oxygen and toxins in the water, returned by 2005 to live in the Delaware Bay, to live and breed in the Delaware Bay. Now, they're not at the levels they used to be. They would talk about shad in the Chesapeake and the Delaware as the waters being so full of them you could walk out and pick them up. We don't think we'll ever get back there. We're also pretty sure that those writings took a little bit of poetic license with saying that it was so thick with fish you could just walk out and pick them up. But we're not back to those levels. And then what's considered the real success story here is the bald eagles resumed nesting here in 2007. To have multiple sets, multiple pairs of bald eagles nesting year after year after year means that the populations are healthy enough and their chicks are successful, that the fish populations, everything is clean enough again for that to return.
Are bald eagles indicator species for some environments?
I don't know that they're officially listed that way. I would say that they are, for me, for healthy fish populations, which are then indicators of water quality. Because they're not going to thrive in areas where there's not high enough fish populations or water that is really, really dirty, because then they won't be able to find the fish. We do use them as an indicator that things are good, but I don't know that they would say it's an indicator species. Does that make sense? How many of you have been to John Hines National Wildlife Refuge? If not, you will go with ecology or ornithology, or I don't know, sometime because it's fun. It's right next to the airport. There are bald eagles that are there almost year round that have been nesting, laying eggs, and then fledging the process of the baby bird being able to go off and live by itself. For, I think, almost 10 years now there, which no one thought was possible. We thought that they were gone from there, that they would be inconstant visitors, but now they're there all the time. So is this a success? So how do we do it, right? That's the important part. This kind of flies a little bit in the face of that. These are the oil spills from 1972 to 2004. This doesn't even include the big ones that have happened since 2004. So there's been a lot of potential for even more bad things to happen. But one of the things they've done is they have stationed in the Delaware Bay boats whose job it is to respond when there's an oil spill. There was one docked in Lewis, Delaware when I went to grad school. It had to respond a couple different times. And these boats are meant for responding to open water oil spills in coastal areas. They have everything they need to respond. The first thing they do when they get there is they have this floating net that they put around the oil spill, and then they skim everything off inside of the net. They then set everything on fire inside of the net. And they have dispersants and other things to move out what does get into other areas. So they started by stationing boats here who could fight oil spills. The worst time for oil spills in the Delaware Bay is spring. Why would it be spring? Migratory birds and migratory fish coming in to reproduce. When are most of the oil spills? Surprisingly fall, which is not a great time, but a better time than spring. So why does this system recover when others don't? One thing is the Clean Water Act put a pretty high priority on cleaning up how we handled water. And because this is an estuary system where the river is going to be moving things offshore, that meant that water wasn't always going to be trapped there, that it was eventually going to get flushed out. Another is the EPA considered this to be an area to spend money on. If they hadn't spent money here to clean things up, it wouldn't have happened. Next is the Delaware River and Basin Commission. You have this commission that's set up by the president at the time and is tasked with keeping this area clean and also keeping it good for transportation. and they do environmental work. PSE&G is New Jersey Gas and Electric. They had impacted pretty horrifically some areas of the bay. So they started the Delaware Bay Estuarine Enhancement Program that has funded research and funded restoration work, where they have replanted salt marshes and other things that they had destroyed. Perhaps the biggest thing is we didn't manage the problems as singular problems. The Delaware Bay has a watershed management strategy where the whole system is managed for its health. The idea that I can't say, all right, well, here you can put in whatever you want, but over here you can't. It's the idea that this is a system, the rules are the same for everybody. And because of the way that industry worked in the Bay, point sources were the biggest problem. Non-point sources made up a very little percentage of the bad pollutants. So by reducing phosphates and detergents, which is non-point-ish, but they would come in from wastewater treatment plants, so that seemed to become a point source. By reducing chemical disposals from industry, we were able to cut back on many of the pollutants entering the system. And because considerable money was spent on taking and buying as much of the areas they could around the waterways and planting plants and shrubs and grasses and other things that would clean the water as it flowed through. So if you could look at all of these things and say, this is what we need to do, one thing ties it together. This was an area that monetarily was worth it to spend the money on, that your return was greater than your investment. And that's often the problem in environmental restoration work and protection, is unless it's worth spending the money on, you may not be able to convince somebody to spend the money on fixing it. They also set up some of the guidelines here that the wastewater treatment plants all over the country use about how to do monitoring. Salem Generating Station was releasing hot water into the system. They added a cooling system to cool down the hot water so that they reduce their thermal pollution. We stopped ditching the salt marshes and started replanting them. They set up preserves and protected areas. There's multiple national wildlife refuges and other refuges and preserved areas as you move through the Delaware Bay. There's the tributary action teams, which work with community stakeholders and community members who want to volunteer to do science projects, to allow them to also have a stake in it. And if you can engage your community, you can get everybody to care that this is what our money is being spent on. The universities, and have you guys heard the phrase before, land grant? The land grant colleges, every state that has land grant that has, I think, agriculture. But the Sea Grant colleges are the colleges, or the Sea Grant program is with any of the states, the United States, that have coastal areas that are attached to them, either the Great Lakes or the Pacific or Atlantic or Gulf of Mexico as their coastal body of water. The Sea Grant colleges put on something called Coast Day. It happens the first Sunday of October in Delaware. It usually happens in September, I think, in Pennsylvania, and New Jersey's might be in the spring, where they have at least one or two places where they're having an entire day dedicated to public education to get people to understand what are the problems in the bay and how do we fix them. In the Delaware one, I worked at it for a number of years. One of the things they do is they talk to people about how to hurricane-proof your house, how to plant native vegetation if you're going to redo your gardens, how to fertilize correctly. But they also have fun things like crab races where people can, like, little kids can bet on which crab will win to win a prize. Crab cake and clam chowder cook-off, and come tour the universities and see what research they're doing here. But the whole thing is to get your community to buy into the fact that this is important to protect these systems. And it works. That public involvement in education is necessary anytime you're trying to change how people care for a system. Currently, the the water here is still really high in nutrient levels. And overall, the bay is still considered relatively low on biological productivity, that the algal load could be higher than it is. We think that there's an accumulation of high nutrient levels, some of it coming from the salt marsh muds themselves, some also from the high bacterial activity within the bay, and then a lot from fertilizers, and not necessarily from farming, but also from golf courses and people's homes. The question is often asked then, is the system undergoing eutrophication because it has high levels of nutrients? And the debate is, but it has low levels of productivity. How can we consider it to be going through eutrophication if it has low levels of productivity? I know scientists that fall on both sides of this question. And I know scientists that I respect deeply that fall on both sides of this question. I'm not sure I have an answer. I think I would say it has gone through eutrophication in the past and it is in the process of recovery from it. I wouldn't say that it is completely recovered, though. Does that make sense? The upper portions of the bay have high amounts of suspended sediment, which is why the productivity is so low. There should be higher levels of algae than there are, but they can't live in cloudy water. Dissolved oxygen levels are good, except for a few places in the summer that have dissolved oxygen levels of 0. We don't know why. It's not predictable, and it's not always the same places. I studied one of these areas. We never got any answers. It wasn't really related to anything. And one of the good things is that our circulation here is driven by the river discharge. If it was driven by mixing from ocean waters coming in, all of this could have taken hundreds of more years to improve. But the river discharge pushing things out helped considerably. If I could, I would teach you guys an entire class on wetlands. That is how much I love them. But I can't, so that's a shame. In Delaware Bay, we have freshwater wetlands, we have tidal wetlands, and we have saltwater wetlands. You see the gamut of the different types of wetlands we have in the United States. There are even forested wetland areas in the Delaware Bay system. These wetlands perform so many ecosystem services. The most important is that they filter out contaminants and high levels of nutrients from the water. But they also provide habitat for birds and fish and shellfish. They provide, many of them, nursery grounds. We have found that most of our commercial fish and commercial shellfish, their young, their larvae or their juveniles, develop in wetlands and marshes and estuaries. And that many of our commercially important ones need those habitats to be healthy for their young to develop, that part of their population crashes have not just been from overfishing, but also from us using them poorly. But wetlands are really sensitive because they can easily be destroyed, particularly as we build closer and closer to the coast. They exist in this very strange place between the land plants and the water. And most of your salt marsh plants cannot extend further on land because they can't compete with those land plants. So where they are in a marsh is set on the lowest end by physical tolerance. How often can they be flooded? How much salt water can they handle? And at the top end by how well they can compete with others. So you find that wetland plants are what we call zoned, or they have high levels of zonation. You find different things at the top, different things as you continue down. So they have high diversity, but at any one point they actually have low diversity, but high diversity overall. Historically, oh man, we destroyed 95% of the wetlands in California since Europeans settled the United States. Not as bad in Delaware. Maybe we lost closer to 50% of them. But we've been replanting. Most of the new loss has been to development. Some of the salt marshes are considered unhealthy, and one of the most important reasons they're considered unhealthy is something I've already talked about, Phragmites australis, an invasive plant that has taken over a lot of these wetlands. So what lives here? 200 species of fish in the Delaware estuary. And then we have the benthic creatures, those that live on the bottom. A lot of them, some you've heard of. Blue crabs, oysters, lots of shrimp species, not necessarily the ones you eat, but lots that are eaten by other things. I'm going to show you some endangered species that live here. There's about 400,000 acres of wetlands, of which 125,000 acres is internationally important because of the animals that live in them. It contains the largest breeding population of horseshoe crabs in the entire world, one of the most ancient creatures still alive today that rivals the cockroach. It is considered one of the most important shorebird migration points in the entire eastern coast of the United States. And because, as one of my professors informed me, if for no other reason, blue crabs live here. He studied blue crab behavior. So what kind of endangered species? We have the dwarf wedge mussels at the top, the short-nosed sturgeon, bog turtles, loggerhead sea turtle, leatherback sea turtle, Kemp's Ridley sea turtle, and green sea turtle have all been known to either utilize the Delaware Bay or to nest here at times, to winter here, to spend summers here. They don't spend their entire life cycle here, but they've been known to be in the Delaware Bay. Sperm whales, fin whales, humpback whales, blue whales, sea whales, and black right whales have also been found in the Delaware Bay and just offshore from here. So if they're here, even if they're only here for a bit, their health could be greatly impacted by what's going on here. And for some of these guys, their impact is that the fish that they eat or the whatever else that they eat spends part of its life cycle here in the Delaware Bay. So birds, the Pea Patch Island Nature Preserve was set up for the largest colony of nesting herons on the East Coast. The second highest concentration of shorebirds in North America happens as they pass through the Delaware Bay. For the types of birds, it's everything from water birds to songbirds to waterfowl and raptors. But the bird that is perhaps most famous for spending part of its life in the Delaware Bay is the red knot, which is the bird at the top there. The only place in the United States that the red knot really stops is the state of Delaware and New Jersey. And it eats one thing and one thing only when it's migrating. Does anyone know what that is? Horseshoe crab eggs, which is why it stops here. Horseshoe crab eggs are remarkably rich in fats, which allow it to pack on a lot of weight in an instant. So if the red knot cannot stop in the Delaware Bay to stack on calories, it cannot continue its migration to Canada. And there's been a concern with the horseshoe crab population declining that the red knot population could decrease. And during the weeks when the red knot is in Delaware and New Jersey, you find that the tourism dollars go way up because people come from all over the country to see red knots. So what are the threats? Pollution. Endangered species are themselves a threat. Erosion, development, unsustainable agriculture. Climate change, altered hydrologic regime, so the ditching of the salt marshes to change water flow. Deforestation, oil spills, invasive species, hazardous materials, fracking. A lot of things we've talked about this semester are threats to this ecosystem. I mentioned Phragmites. I'll turn off the light for a moment so you can see the difference between introduced and native. Do you see that one is significantly taller than the other? That is the only way to tell them apart in the field. Having said that, you can almost never tell them apart in the field because this picture was taken at a place where you could. How genetically similar are they? They're the same species. They're different haplotypes. They're over 99.9% genetically identical. We don't know what makes one invasive form and the other not. No one knows. The Asian shore crab was our first big invader. And then the green crab came over. And the good news is that the Asian short crab and the green crab sometimes kill each other. So that can take care of part of your invasive threat, but not all of the time. The mitten crab is another crab invader. And then we have this little cute guy down here. This nice little mammally guy with a face full of whiskers and a tail. The nutria. It's cute, isn't he? Looks kind of like a beaver mixed with like a cat. But he destroys places where beavers live and eats a lot of things. He's invasive. There are also two other really important invasive species that I don't have listed up there. Those are MSX and Dermo. What do those sound like they might be? They're diseases. Specifically, they are oyster diseases. So the oyster population has been overharvested, but MSX and Dermo have greatly impacted the oyster population. All of a sudden, they appeared. And they appeared at separate times, and they're killing off the oysters. I kind of mentioned all this already. This was the beach water quality summary from 2012. Only one beach in Delaware exceeded testable limits, and it exceeded them, I believe, on less than 10% of the samples tested that year exceeded their limits. So even though there were all of those threats of pollution on the last slide, the bay is still healthy. Erosion is a problem. We have worked on beach replenishment all throughout the Delaware Bay by bringing in more sand to fix beach erosion. It works somewhat. If you want to talk more about that, let's talk some other time. The big problem is the sand comes from someplace else. So if you're dependent upon the community in the sand, it changes things. How different? In my research, it completely changed the way that phosphate cycled through groundwater in sandy ecosystems. No one knew why. When you lose your wetlands, you have higher erosion, which leads to more loss of land. Agricultural erosion is a problem. The land in the southern portions of New Jersey and Delaware is subsiding, so it is sinking as a result still of the last glaciation. And there's storm erosion. The biggest way, absolute biggest way to stop storm erosion, living coastlines. What's that? Salt marshes, seagrass beds, mud flats, things that naturally dampen wave motion. Development is a problem here because they are trying to develop on a lot of areas that should be preserved. They're developing lots of farms. I was talking to somebody and they said one of the saddest things, when I went to grad school in Southern Delaware, when I started and I would drive back up to this area, there were a lot more farms than there are now. Many more farms than there are now. But also there was this gorgeous winery where people had like lots of weddings and lots of events. And the family sold it for many, many millions of dollars. And it now doesn't grow grapes at all or crops. And they used to grow like vegetables and fruits on the winery. No, it grows houses. Really expensive townhouses that no one down there can afford. And the problem becomes that in these beach areas, the prices are outpacing the salaries of the people that live there. So people are buying them as weekend and summer properties. They could share those things and we could have more natural area. That's one. I like that it's named Heron Bay, but there's no herons there anymore. The agriculture here is soybeans, corn, chicken, pigs. There's a lot of it. If you go to the Chesapeake Bay, there's more chickens and pigs than there are people. Delaware Bay isn't quite that bad. Oysters are a sustainable food source. They produce lots of offspring every year. Economically, they're important. It takes about 3 years for one of them to reach market size in the Delaware Bay. They were abundant. And oysters are really important because they clean the water. They said that at one point in time, oysters in the Chesapeake Bay could clean all of the water in the bay in like less than a week. It's no longer true. Why did they decline? Well, they were the #1 fishery product in the United States in the 1880s. It's not shocking. It wasn't fish, it was oysters. 1930s, we were catching 2 million bushels a year. 1950s, 1 billion bushels a year, and so forth and further down. By the late 1990s, they'd almost entirely disappeared. Overharvesting, there's dermo and MSX diseases, but also poor recruitment. Oysters are strange in the way that they reproduce and recruit. So they lay their eggs, and they release the eggs and the sperm. The larvae form. The larvae are motile, and they swim around. And then when the larvae are ready to become juveniles, they have to sense that this is where I'm supposed to end up. They sense that by something that's produced by adult oysters. So they're looking for the signal from other oysters, this is where you're supposed to live. If they don't sense it, they will never settle and they will die as a juvenile or as a larvae stage. As the population itself is dwindling, the recruitment drops off of the juveniles because they don't know where they're supposed to be. What is strange is you don't need to have a living adult oyster to get that signal. They can get the signal from crushed oyster shells. We don't know what the signal is. We'll skip the diseases. We started planting oysters. We call it oyster gardening as we take care of the baby oysters in protected areas and then eventually put them out later. We've been increasing the bushels landed per year since the early 2000s. One of my favorite stories from being out in research is doing research on a site. And it was actually one of the scariest sites I did research on because my advisor used to leave us there. We did shifts and we'd be there for like 48 hours at a time. And some of you heard me talk about the one like weird like night shift where these guys drove up in a truck with the sawed-off shotguns. Yeah, that place. So this guy wants to talk to us about his oysters. And we're all judging him because he only has like half a mouth of teeth. And he's talking about how much he loves oysters and he was out there catching them, da-da-da-da-da-da. And then I was like, well, what are you going to do with them? I assume he's going to eat them. No, I'm catching all of the juvenile oysters. My wife hates this, but I come out every year and I capture all of the ones I can that I know are just under the size that they need to be for people to take them. And I take them home. I've converted my entire basement to oyster tanks, and I raise them until they're large enough that they can't be taken by people, and then I bring them back and I plant them in the places that I've taken them from. He's like, I love fishing, and I love eating fish and oysters that are raised in this bay, so I need to do something to make it better. He started a one-man oyster saving campaign. His entire basement is full of tanks of oysters. And I remember thinking, A, I'm a really horrible person for judging him. And B, I was just like, why? He's like, I love this area. This is where my family's from. One of the things that keeps the bay healthy is oysters. Everyone who's from here knows that. I have to do my part. So I protect the oysters. You find people like that all over areas when you start to look and talk to the people who've been there for generations. And partnering him, and he was linked in with some of the groups that were doing oyster work because he talked to everybody about his love of oysters. By 2011, we'd planted 2.4 million bushels of shell onto areas to increase recruitment of oysters. We expect that per year, there's going to be between 1/4 to 500,000 increase in the number of bushels landed. It's insane. And it's working. By putting out crushed oyster shell, we're changing things. Also, we're finding that there's a higher rate now, because of natural selection, of oysters that are not, or that are more resistant to dermo and MSX than there used to be. It just takes time. And this is a picture of them planting the oyster shell. They take out barges full of it and like dump it over the edge where they want to put it. This guy is doing oyster gardening, where it's a little floating area with the oyster shells, and it's done at people's docks. If you want to get involved, all you have to do is have a place for it to be. We find that the oysters survive really well in these. It also allows them to be in the water for spawning purposes. I mentioned public education. Climate change is a concern here. Having said that, the biggest concern is, will the wetland plants be able to keep up with climate change? But the EPA has designated the Delaware Estuary as part of its Climate Ready Estuary program. So there are people working on climate change. Fracking. Because of fracking, the American Rivers Council voted the Delaware Bay the most endangered American river in 2010 due to fracking of the Marcellus Shale. It's important to remember fracking is exempt to Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Air Act, Right to Know Act, and Superfund Act. But on the flip side, Delaware Bay is also doing a lot for wind power. It's one of the areas where we are trying to start an offshore wind power. I mentioned the horseshoe crabs and the red knots. Hurricanes. So far, there haven't been any big ones there recently, but Delaware Bay could have disastrous effects if a hurricane comes through. But there are people there working all the time on better prediction models and better evacuation routes. And as I mentioned, they will teach you how to hurricane-proof your house. That is all for the Delaware Bay.